Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to our webinar to celebrate the launch, slightly belated after the actual coming out of the winter issue of Jerusalem Quarterly. Welcome, everyone. We're very excited on behalf of the co-editor of Jerusalem Quarterly, Lisa Taraki, and myself, Alex Winder, the other co-editor. We're really excited to have some of the contributors to that special issue of the Jerusalem Quarterly organized around the theme of Jerusalem's interrupted futures. I want to thank Celestine Naili, who was the guest editor of that special issue and who will say a bit about the kind of overarching theme and also present on her contribution there. I also want to thank the other contributors who are joining us today, Julio Harris and Semi, as well as all of the contributors to the special issue. I also want to thank Laura and Carol and all the IPS staff for making the webinar possible. And of course, thank all of you for joining us today. Basically, the format of the event, I'll turn it over to Celestine in a few minutes to say a little bit about the theme of the issue overall. And then we'll have presentations by four of the contributors, Julio Moreno Cirujano, Harris Ford, Sami Gurkatalai, and Celestine Naili. I'll introduce each of them before they speak, and we'll have an opportunity for Q&A after each speaker, as well as a open Q&A session at the end. But just to let everyone know that Julio has to leave before the end. So if you have questions for him, especially, please do put those in the Q&A function before or during his talk or after his talk. You can put questions in the Q&A at any time, and I encourage you to do that. And again, really excited to have all of our speakers say a little bit about their contributions to this special issue of the Jerusalem Quarterly. I'm going to turn it over now to Celestine to say a little bit more about the issue. Celestine Naili is the issue editor, as I mentioned, and she's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Social Sciences, Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Basel, and a research associate at the Institut Français du Proche-Orient, IFPO. She's the author of La Palestine entre patrimoine et providence, pardon my very bad French, and was recently awarded a consolidator grant by the Swiss National Science Foundation for a project dealing with the interrupted futures of the Arab world that will run from 2024 until 2029. Congratulations, Celestine, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Alex, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm very happy that we'll be able to finally launch this special issue, which was a real pleasure to coordinate. And I would like to thank the editorial committee again for welcoming the issue and for making it possible. And of course, to all the contributors, a great thank you also. To give you a sense, I mean, this started with this special issue started with a call for papers, which began with the observation that facts on the ground very powerfully shape everyday life in Jerusalem, but also influence the way we look at the recent history of the city. So what can history and historians do in this situation? Should we limit ourselves to keeping an inventory of these facts created by sheer force? Or can we do more? As Reinhard Koselleck pointed out, history may be made by the victors in the short run, but ultimately historical gains in knowledge stem from the vanquished. And indeed, the history of Jerusalem contains many threads of unfulfilled alternative futures that need to be uncovered and unmuted. The analysis of interrupted futures that we propose in this special issue is not counterfactual history that consists in imagining other outcomes. The approach used here is not speculative, but rather interpretive. We all base ourselves on archival work, operating very much in the spirit of Jacques Derrida's conception of the archive as a store for the future. This work entails seizing elements of history, such as plans, projects, and programs, and saving them from oblivion so that a new generation might base their understanding of history on a more complete panorama of the past than that created by the victors. So in this issue, the authors take hold of threads of unfinished schemes conceived just before or during important moments of rupture: the end of the Ottoman Empire, the termination of the British Mandate, and the abrupt close of the Jordanian administration of Jerusalem. The plans and projects presented in several of these articles were the result of governmental or international initiatives at various levels. Some plans, such as the British Mandate scheme to build a parliamentary building in the city, point to the vivid contradictions of the colonial political structure. By contrast, it is important to remember that in the case of the Ottoman and the Jordanian administrations of the city, Palestinians were key political actors on the local level, something that was less the case during the Mandate period. So we have the pleasure of having four of the articles represented here today, but four others, unfortunately, are absent. And so I would like to just represent them very briefly by giving a short outline of what these other articles also bring forth. So Maysoon Sharkawi provides, in some ways, a nice companion piece to Semir Gökatalai's article, with her review of the recent exhibition about the Arab fairs entitled Al-Ma'rad, that was curated by Nadia Abu Saada and Luzan Munayyer at the Khalil Sakakini Cultural Center in Ramallah at the end of last year. She provides additional context concerning the obstacles faced by Palestinian Arab efforts at small-scale industrialization and expansion of trade during the Mandate period. Ilan Pape, in his article, analyzes the different attempts to create an Arab or Islamic university in British Mandate Jerusalem. While none of these plans succeeded, there were institutions such as the Arab College that played an important role in creating cultural capital and a national consciousness. Pape writes that these institutions, and I quote, would contribute after the Nakba to the resurrection of Palestinian education, scholarship, and culture, despite the horrific catastrophe of 1948. This cultural continuity meant that Palestinian culture was not obliterated in the Nakba, and that those who survived it could build on the mandatory legacy for the continued cultural struggle along the political one. Pape hereby introduces the individual and social dimension of this history of possibilities. In their joint article, Vincent Lemire and Maria Chiara Rioli compare the potential of two underexplored sets of archives: the municipal archives of Jerusalem, particularly for the Jordanian period, and the UNRWA archives, which, by the way, are at the center of the very last issue of JQ, which I also invite you to discover. While the first, meaning the municipal archives, highlight little-known efforts at rehabilitating and restructuring the eastern part of the city, the UNRWA archives contain what Rioli calls the genealogical, demographic, and social history of Palestinian refugees, as well as traces of their political and individual ambitions, efforts, and potentialities. Michelle Campos, who we had hoped to have with us here today, emphasizes in her article, comparing the Ottoman tramway scheme to the existing Israeli light rail, that the plan for a tramway in the early 20th century was intimately linked to the particular form of Ottoman urban citizenship that existed in Jerusalem during that period. That idea of citizenship included what she calls a modernist discourse that underscores Jerusalem as a city of all of its residents. By contrast, today's Israeli light rail signals the limits of Jerusalem as a shared city in both practice and imagination, as she says. Now, let me turn it over to Julio Joriano, who will present an article that he wrote together with Yair Wallach. Julio is a PhD candidate at SOAS in London and is writing his dissertation on colonial material culture in British Mandate Palestine. The floor is yours, Julio.
Thank you, Palestine, for the presentation, for putting together this special issue. Alex, for chairing the event, and obviously all the IPS staff behind the scenes. Now, I am going to present a paper I co-wrote with Yair Wallach And the title is, let me present, yeah, this one. I started too fast, yes. So the title of this paper is Unveiled Parliament, British Colonial Plans for a Legislative Assembly in Jerusalem. And like the rest of the issue, this issue of the Jerusalem Quarterly is the story about something that never happened. At some point, Yair and I were looking into the material remains of the British government in Palestine and came across the project of the central government offices. This was a large building or a compound that would accommodate all government departments, replacing the archipelago of rented offices across Jerusalem. This was never built. But we started to read relevant archival material and realized that the idea of a legislative council hall appeared and disappeared through the 2 decades and a half in which this project was active. The historiography generally has dismissed the idea of the Legislative Council. It is usually mentioned briefly, if at all, and always as a prop to assess British institution building as a failure. While British government in Palestine was not particularly successful, especially when talking about institution building, this paper, we think, help us understanding the multiple British approaches to a constitutional debate in Palestine at different stages of the mandate. The body of my presentation today will contextualize the multiple designs of the Assembly Hall within the architectural structures that it was projected, and also within the political circumstances that made this projection relevant. But we need to have in mind 2 caveats during this presentation. First, the Legislative Assembly Hall was always designed as part of the central government office. This means the legislative power was always understood as an attachment to the British executive, which speaks volumes about the lack of independency of this institution. In other words, this would have been a representative body, but not necessarily a democratic one. And second, while British projects consider this parliament to be progressively more important, to eventually become indispensable in early 1940s, neither Palestinians nor Zionists were ever consulted about their needs or thoughts regarding this architectural project. So in 1922, High Commissioner Samuels first proposed a legislative council that could replace the informal advisory council. This would have been a representative body as well, but it would have had virtually no authority and was designed to have a strong British Jewish majority. The Arab leadership rejected the proposal and the population boycotted the elections. But this was not the end of this idea. After the 1929 Burak riots, came the Passfield White Paper, which closed the door to Jewish immigration. But in 1931, the MacDonald Black Letter reopened it again, doors to Jewish immigration. In this process of rethinking Palestine constitutionally, the idea of the Legislative Council was retrieved. Austin Barr Harrison, at the time the chief architect of the mandate, was designing a central government office building for economic reasons. It was cheaper and more efficient to have all departments under one roof. He was required to introduce the assembly hall on the project. The project was being designed already, and in the middle of this design, he was forced to place it somewhere. The architect placed it at the back of the building, rather unconvincingly, but he was so unhappy with the proportions of the design that he scrapped it completely and started anew. Now, the image that you're seeing here is the result of the second design. The assembly hall is not the red wing, it is rather the central part of this building. It is the semicircular part of the building that connects the 2 other wings. So it could be said that it was at once a deliberative heart of the executive building, but also it could be understood as an entrapped parliament by the colonial government. The negotiations about the political institution continued, and the Arab leadership seemed to be receptive to the establishment of this representative body, despite its clear limitations. They probably thought of it as a platform to proclaim their grievances. However, Zionist leadership strongly rejected this proposal because the representative power had shifted from the original proposal in the 20s. The British House of Commons in London and then the House of Lords shut it down in early 1936. This could have been one of the reasons for the general strike that followed briefly afterwards, which eventually led to the revolt in 37 to 39. Now, the building project was paused and the majority of the government departments were accommodated in the King David Hotel. In 1938, the Peel report and the idea of partition altogether were rejected. So a unitary deliberative institution became a priority once more. Meantime, the violence of the revolt made it necessary for the government to project a secure location for all its departments, reviving the idea of the central government office. Percy Winter, the chief architect of the mandate at this time, had designed rather a somber building for the government office. It could be built by modules, accommodating a growing government. And just like some years before, the High Commissioner communicated the architect the need to introduce the assembly hall somewhere in this developing project. Winter, instead of starting anew, decided to attach a wing. And here we see the wing of the legislative assembly that looks like a protuberance on the left. Again, the legislative is read as an appendix of the British government, echoing the aesthetics of a monumental prison-like building. Importantly, while the partition of Palestine was abandoned and they were literally designing binational parliament, the logic of partition had entrenched. The assembly hall was shared, but unlike the previous designs, the common rooms were segregated. One room for Arab members, another one for Jewish members. They would prepare the sessions and rest in separate spaces. In August 1939, the project was approved. A budget was allocated, tenders were being published, and the plot of land purchased by for this purpose was started to be excavated. This means the parliament was being built. But the following month, the war was declared and the project was paused once more. In 1943, the mandatory government started to plan ahead for the post-war reconstruction of Palestine, and the central government building figured quite high in the list of priorities. The tone of discussion, however, had shifted. Economic or security considerations gave way to symbolic dimension of this project. Both the Palestinian and Zionist leadership at the time had managed to build flagship buildings for their national and political projects. The British had also built some important public buildings, but the High Commissioner residence is in Jabal Mukaber, far from both the old and the new city. And the Archaeology Museum was not properly a governmental building, and also it was partially financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. There are other buildings like the Jerusalem Town Hall, Post Office, or even the Barclays building, but none of them were significant enough in the eyes of the mandate government. The project of the central government office became once more an opportunity to make a statement about British legacy in the Holy Land. It was once more being planned by Austen Barr Harrison, But the government had grown considerably by that time, so it needed a new plot of land. The former site near the Mamila pool was too small, and they purchased a larger plot in Talvie. Harrison projected a group of buildings in a compound. The Legislative Council was part of the central building, next to the Secretariat, the Attorney General, and the High Commissioner office. This is at the core of this complex. In other words, it was located in the most important part of the building. In fact, the architect proposed to expand it up to 20% of the built space, which would include a library, restaurants, retirement rooms, even a monumental staircase. We can see from this model that domes, columns, and other neo-Orientalist elements have been dropped. Security plays a major role in this design. In fact, by being inside the central building, the assembly hall was enclosed within all the buildings of the compound, removed from the society it was supposed to represent. At the end of 1947, Harrison was notified of the suspension of the project. This is on the 6th of November of 1947, only 23 days before the UN partition plan was voted. Britain withdrew in May 48 without having built a central government office, nor a legislative assembly hall. So why is this important? The architectural project alone, this is besides the political negotiations to establish a legislative council, the architectural project left thousands of pages of documentation, including deliberation, images, designs, schedules of requirements, clay models like the one we're seeing here in the image. There were a total of 3 plots of land purchased around Jerusalem for this purpose. One of them was even started to be excavated. An endless amount of bureaucratic work hours were dedicated to this. And the project expanded over 25 years, and it was still in place until the very last breath of the mandate. Dismissing it just because it was unsuccessful would be short-sighted. In sum, we think that the deliberations over the Legislative Assembly chamber can be seen as a seismograph of British plans for Palestine's political and constitutional future. The change in place of the council within the central government office reflects the internal debate about the nature of British presence in Palestine and the tangibility of this representative institution at every stage of the mandate era. I hope this was interesting, and if you would like to know more about this project, you can always read the whole paper online in the Jerusalem Quarter issue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you very much. I think this surely generates a lot of questions, and since you have to leave us early, I think I'm going to hand it over to Alex, I think, who has a look at the questions coming in.
Yeah, I want to encourage anyone, no questions as of yet, but encourage anyone who has questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A function, to drop them in the chat. I guess in case people are still thinking about questions, maybe I'll ask a question of Julio. I mean, I'm curious how you see this project. You know, are there other kind of comparable projects that you see it kind of connected to? Are there things that seemingly were fast-tracked for actually kind of being constructed, whereas this seemed to kind of linger? When I think about kind of, purchasing plots of land and thinking about, constructing something, I also think about the decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem recently, for example, and kind of plans to build a new embassy building in Jerusalem. So I'm kind of curious, obviously you did a nice kind of job of explaining how to kind of think about this particular project and why it's important not to just kind of dismiss it because it wasn't built. But are there ways in which you kind of see this in relation to other kinds of projects that also kind of helps us think about priorities or visions or imaginations?
Yes, thank you, Alice, for the question. Yes, of course. This project was not built, but other projects were. And it's mentioned actually very clearly that, for example, the Tegart project, the Tegart fortresses took precedence on the parliament. At some point, they were deciding, and the office, the architect office was swamped with the project of the Tegart buildings, while the parliament just started to being reflowed. Yeah, it's clear that there are decisions that were being. There was a plan, but the actual decision is only taken once, and this parliament started to be built just once. There were other other plans, other projects that took precedence.
We also have a question from Sam Bahur, who asked, throughout these phases, were the British submitting their plans to the United Nations or the League of Nations? I mean, given that it was a mandate, was this kind of strictly within the British purview, or was there any kind of degree of kind of international input or consultation?
That's always the question. Theoretically, this is a mandate. They had to respond to the international community, but in practice, I think Palestine was very much governed as a colony, and the conversations on this architectural project, it never leaves the architect's office in relation to the High Commissioner. Very rarely we have input from London, from Colonial Office London. So it's very much a local government issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? And again, you can feel free to, even if a question occurs to you later, you can feel free to drop it in the Q&A. I think if everyone will allow me, I'm going to actually switch the order of presentations, because I think we can stay in the mandate period now and kind of keep things chronological. So if no one objects, I'll turn it over to Semih now. Semih Gurkatalai is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California, San Diego, and he'll be speaking about his article, Fair Competition, the Arab Fair in mid-1930s Palestine.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Alex. Can you hear me now? Thank you so much. And before my presentation today, I want to thank you, Dr. Falestin Naile, for the special issue, for editing it, and for including me in this project. And my presentation today is about the part of my PhD thesis. And my PhD thesis, or broader project, is about the political economy of trade fairs in the Middle East in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, or the late Ottoman Empire and the interwar Middle East. And today I'm just gonna present only a small part of my thesis, which is the Arab Fair in Jerusalem, which took place in Mandatory Palestine in 1933 and in 1934. And my thesis is about the political and economic dimensions of business gatherings in the Balkans and the Middle East generally. And today my presentation is also a small analysis or summary of the Arab Fair from an economic and political perspective. If we can see the origins of the Arab Fair, laid in the Tel Aviv Fair or the Levant Fair, which took place in Tel Aviv and organized by Zionist organizations since early 1920s, like early 1920s, Zionist organizations in Palestine, also in Europe and the United States, they hosted several trade fairs in Tel Aviv since the 1920s, and the Levant Fair continued until 1936 or until the Great Revolt. Excuse me. We can see changing attitudes of Arab businessmen or Arab public in general in Palestine towards the Levant Fair. Initially, we can see the participation of Arabs, Palestinians in the Levant Fair in the 1920s. They participated in as exhibitors, buyers, or just visitors. But after the riots in 1929, we can see their attitudes towards the Levant Fair change, and eventually until or during 1930s, we can see the Arabs generally boycotted the Levant Fair. But starting in 1933, they started or they hosted their own fair in Jerusalem. It was a small scale. It was a just a short fair that took place twice in Jerusalem. And if you look at such fairs, they are initially business gatherings or commercial meetings, but they have also political messages, political functions. And actually, if you look at the Arab Fair, the British, the colonial government or the British government in the United Kingdom, they played actually no role in the organization and operation of the Arab Fair. Nonetheless, they own the fair in international organizations such as the League of Nations, stating as if they granted their support, as if they endorsed the Arab Fair. And Arab leaders, journalists, and intellectuals, they disagreed with the British claim. And for example, according to Al Jamia Al Arabiya, the British played no role in the organization of the Arab Fair, but they own it, and they criticized the British attitudes because the British supported the Levant Fair, which was organized by the Zionists, but the British did not want to provide any financial, bureaucratic, or other sort of aid to Arabs in organizing their own fair. And why? Because according to, from the perspective of the British, the Arabs did not invite Jews to the Arab fair, but according to Al Jamia Al Arabiya and other Palestinian newspapers, there was not such condition for Jews. And actually, we can understand the British attitude towards trade fairs even from the accounts of the British newspapers, such as The Times. And The Times thought that exhibits at the Arab Fair were pathetic compared to those of at the Levant Fair. You can see similar such constructs or such comparison between the Arab and Levant fairs in other Western outlets as well. In other words, although Western sources, especially British newspapers, British official, semi-official accounts, they dislike and actually make fun of the Arab fair. Officially, the British own it as if they supported it. If we look at the history of the fair, after 1934, it was not held, and we don't see any fair for the rest of the mandate, although there were similar exhibitions by Arabs, after the Second World War, but especially for the rest of the interwar period, we don't see any such fair that was hosted or arranged by Arabs in Palestine. And in my research, in this article, in the special issue, also in my broader project, I explain such, disruption or interruption of the fair from a political perspective, and stating that the Arab fair received limited support from other governments other Arab governments or political leaders in the rest of the Arab world. And there was practically no governmental support in Palestine, although the British government, both in the center, colonial center, and in Palestine, all British officials, they wholeheartedly supported the Levant Fair. We don't see such support, such endorsement for the Arab Fair. And if you look at it from an artistic or cultural perspective, the Arab Fair was a success. And actually it brought hundreds of artists, merchants, young people, intellectuals from the Arab Middle East, also from North Africa. But from an economic and political perspective, it was not successful. And if you compare the Arab Fair in Jerusalem to its counterparts in the rest of the post-Ottoman world in the interwar period in the Balkans and the Middle East, we can see that the collaboration between businessmen and governmental authorities was key to the success of such fairs. Examples included those in Cairo, Thessaloniki, Belgrade, Plovdiv, Izmir, and also the best, I guess, the counterpart to compare it was the Levant Fair. We can see that all these fairs in the rest of the post-Ottoman world, they were initially small-scaled and local initiatives. But thanks to the collaboration between business classes or business associations and governmental authorities, they turned into internationally known and financially successful fairs over time. But the interruption of the Arab Fair prevented its host city, Jerusalem, from taking benefits of such fairs. Why? Because if you look at the benefits, both in the short-term and long-term benefits of such fairs, we can see them. They created employment, they brought revenue to municipalities, they attracted tourists to host cities, and there are many more financial, cultural benefits of such fairs. But the interruption of the Arab Fair, because of the lack of official support and because of the British double standard, could not bring such benefits to Jerusalem and Palestinians in this period. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Sami. And if anyone has questions, again, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or put them in the chat. We'll have a kind of open Q&A at the end, of course, as questions come to you, but we'll also have the opportunity immediately after each speaker. While folks are perhaps kind of thinking or typing out their questions for Sami, we actually have a few questions for Julio that came in after the Q&A. So I'll pose one of those now. From Randy de Guilhem for Julio. Although it was, of course, a real architectural political project, the question is, can one also look at the unbuilt parliament as a metaphor for the British mandate itself?
Yes, of course. I'm very fond of these sort of metaphors because we can read and we can interpret what happened through multiple lights. And yes, somehow British imperial control left something undone. They left without building much of Palestine constitutionally. Another interesting metaphor as well is that the government offices were hosted at the hotel, at the King David Hotel, for over a decade. So, like, and this was mentioned directly in documents, like they were ready to pack up their luggages and leave. No? So yes, it was something left undone, and we're left wondering. No?
And a question for Sami from Sam Bahur again. Are there records of the firms that exhibited at each fair? Do we know who the actual participants in the Arab Fair were?
And I don't know or I could not find a complete list, but there are, articles mentioning several firms saying that such firms, these firms were particularly successful. They were their exhibits were good, and also in later accounts, like the classified ads of these firms, I can get a sense who were actually participated in. Why? Because many firms, many exhibitors, both Palestinians or other exhibitors from other countries, and they received medals, prizes from the jury during the fair, both fairs, and at later year or as in the rest of the decades, they marketed, advertised such prizes, so I can get a sense who actually exhibited, but I don't have the complete list for the Arab Fair, but for the Levant Fair, I have, because they publish catalogs after the fair and they gave full, names, full accounts. But for the Arab fairs, both fairs, I don't have the complete list.
Do you have a sense of kind of what were the, based on the incomplete information you have, like what were the kind of most, what were people kind of selling or exhibiting or kind of how did they make use of the fair? What were the major firms that kind of participated?
In both for Palestinians and other groups, I guess the most common thing was textiles, like the textile by different types of the textile companies, and also some agricultural products. But it's not just agricultural commodities and products, I will say. They were also popular. And if you look at, we can see kind of specialization between foreign participants. For example, those from Aleppo, they have certain type of products. For example, they exhibited shoes or etc. And from Damascus, more textiles. From Lebanon, soap. Also in Palestine, you can see such the differences based on the host cities or based on the participants' origins. For example, if there are soap factories, you can see participants exhibited their most famous products or most demanded products at the fair.
Wonderful. Any other questions for Simi?
If there are no other questions, I'll try a question myself. And I apologize. I sometimes go off camera because I cough a lot, so that's why I disappear every once in a while. Simi, I wanted to ask you what I find interesting in your approach is finally that we see how the comparison allows us to reconstitute some of the potential that wasn't able to see the day with the Arab fairs. Like, and I guess that's something that comes out more generally maybe in your PhD thesis. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about this also as an approach just to look at some of these issues from a comparative perspective on the post-Ottoman level.
Thank you so much for the question. In my thesis, like I have the late Ottoman part, then the interwar part, and I adopt two types of comparisons. First, the Ottoman and post-Ottoman countries with their counterparts in the rest of the world, like South America, East Asia, or other countries that have similar problems or issues with economic development, I will say. And other types of comparisons is the comparisons between post-Ottoman countries. Of course, it's not easy to make such comparisons because some of them were politically independent or economically more developed, and some of them were colonies. It's not easy to compare them. But I think if we have such comparisons, we can understand not only the potentials of such fairs that could have provided to Jerusalem and Palestinians, but also understands the British attitudes towards Arabs in general. Because, fairs, they're just one part of the story, larger story. Even for the economic life, fairs were just one part of the bigger problems or bigger concerns, bigger issues. And when we compare it, not only with the Levant Fair or the other, counterparts in the Middle East and the Balkans, we can see actually we can better grasp the relationship between colonial authorities and Palestinians. And I think such comparisons are also useful because if you look at the colonies or colonials mandates in the Middle East, including Lebanon, Syria, and in the 20s, the Iraq, we can see that the worst case in terms of government support was basically Palestinian Arabs when it came to business associations and trade fairs. And it's not just only between Yeshu or, or in general Zionist enterprises and Palestinian enterprises, but even if we make comparisons between Palestinian Arabs and Syrians, we can see that the British attitude was the worst in terms of support to business classes, indigenous business classes. Thank you for the question. I don't know if I can, if I replied.
Thank you very much. That was very, very instructive. Thank you.
Yeah. If there's no further questions at the moment, we'll turn now to Harris Ford, who is a PhD student at the University of Saskatchewan, Canada, located on Treaty 6 territory. Harris's work focuses on relations between the Mashriq and the West, especially through the United Nations, as well as global communication networks and the decolonization of information. And he's speaking today about his article, I Won't Say I Wanted the Job, the United Nations Search for a Special Municipal Commissioner in Jerusalem, 1948 to 49. Harris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you, everybody, as well. Palestine for believing in this article and having it part of this, Julio and Semi for being here, and the Institute for Palestine Studies as well for setting this up. Laura behind the scenes doing a lot of stuff here. So just thank you for having me on here. It's still incredible how much this little project has gone for me. So just thank you. I'll share screen here. Okay. So this article is all about a special municipal commissioner for Jerusalem, which is a clunky term that we'll get unpacked a little bit more here. But essentially, you can think of this special municipal commissioner as essentially a quasi-mayor for Jerusalem that was attempted by the United Nations right at the turn, right at Nakba, as the British mandate was receding, what the future of Jerusalem was going to look like. Also very important right off the start here, the United Nations is imperial and acted imperial throughout this whole venture as well. So if we think about imperialism as being about relationships and the relational aspect, the United Nations was incredibly imperial in this regard, not only for trying to get a city under its control through the General Assembly, but also in the negotiations and discussions with Palestinians in particular, but also Arab delegations and Zionists as well. The construction of the Jerusalem question, which it was often called, was created by the United Nations to only be solved by the United Nations as well. So that's what I'm going to be discussing today. So we've got the initial United Nations in Lake Success, New York here. And this whole affair was incredibly scrambly as well. This was very, very rushed. So the mandate, of course, was supposed to end midnight, May 15th, 1948. And there had been discussions about what to do with Jerusalem, going back at least until 1916 with the Sykes-Picot agreement. There was a brief sentence there, Hussein McMahon correspondence as well. Little discussions of mentioning, okay, what is Jerusalem going to look like? And that ended up with the League of Nations mandate So the British, as we've heard earlier today as well, the British had a massive part in Palestine, and Jerusalem just kept being pushed along in a lot of ways. These ideas of making the city international, which is another way of saying not Palestinian, not Israeli, or not Zionist, future Israeli. And then later on as well, especially with King Abdullah of Jordan not being Jordanian, as Abdullah had big goals of being the king of Jerusalem as well. So a lot of discussions through the League of Nations, through the mandate, and then through UNSCOP, so the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, that set up the famous partition of Palestine, which, as it's well known, created a Jewish zone and a Palestinian zone, the two-state solution that we're still unfortunately grappling with. But it also created a third zone, this international zone. And internationalization is another clunky term. I like to think of it as a cookie cutter. So you've got it nicely rolled out. You've got your dough. It's all wonderful, and then you cookie cutter in Jerusalem out of this Palestine picture. So it's just about a 30-kilometer radius around Jerusalem that the United Nations saw was not fit to be Palestinian or Arab or Jewish. It needed to be separate, it needed to be protected, and it needed to be safeguarded. And the United Nations took that upon itself through UNSCOP, which of course was boycotted by Palestinians. And this whole internationalization scheme was very much pushed against by people on the ground, of Palestinians, of Arabs, and of Zionists as well, who saw various different means for Jerusalem and different government features for Jerusalem. So this is the little area that the UN attempted. And there was nothing really in UNSCOP about what Jerusalem was going to be. And as May 15th approached in the General Assembly, in discussions going on there, it just kept getting pushed, and nothing happened until May 7th. So we're talking a week before Britain's pulling out. This has been known for a very long time that the mandate was going to end, and the UN didn't start discussing this until May 7th. And what was given for criteria for choosing a municipal commissioner as well was that it needed to be approved by 4 different entities. So it wasn't just something that the UN could declare, but there had to be 4 entities. But it's really important who these 4 entities were. So one of them, of course, the United Nations. One of them was the Provisional Zionist Government. The third one was the British High Commissioner for Palestine. So, of course, we're still in the mandate period. So the British High Commissioner for Palestine had to approve this. If that's not imperial, I don't know what is. And then the fourth one was a vague conglomeration of Arab delegations. And that's something else that's really, really important about this whole project, is the homogenization of Arab identities by the United Nations. There was no direct consultation with Palestinians. And through all of the conversations and conferences, Zionists got an individual mention. It was always just Arabs, whether that was racial or what that was. It didn't matter if it was Egyptian, Iraqi, Jordanian, it was just Arabs. And there was I never saw anything throughout this project or through what the United Nations was doing of much direct discussions about Palestinians or any direct consultation with Palestinians either. So the United Nations, the British High Commissioner for Palestine, the Provisional Zionist Government, and this vague conglomeration of Arab delegates had to sign off on this, and it ended up being a Jordanian individual who signed off on the municipal commissioner. And there was a massive promotion of religion as well as a reason why the United Nations needed to intervene. So this continuing of the trope of religious violence being at the heart of any Palestinian Zionist conflict. So Judaism and Islam, the source, or what the United Nations decided upon was to have a neutral Christian commissioner. Fitting, you look at the delegations for the United Nations at this time as well, very early on in the United Nations, and the vast majority would have been very pleased to see a Christian quasi-mayor of Jerusalem as well. And there was also a really big emphasis on pacifism as conflict broke out at the or even the predicted conflict that was going to break out and continue after the Nakba. The pacifism of this municipal commissioner was really highly promoted, which was why it was decided to be a Quaker. And the first person who was decided upon was this stern-looking individual, Clarence Pickett. This is from the back cover of his autobiography. He was from Pennsylvania, and he was the first person who was fully accepted to be the municipal commissioner. It just so happened that on the day that he was called about this post, he had a doctor's appointment, and his doctor was worried about his health, and so he did not accept the position. Had he not had the doctor's appointment, maybe he would have, but he decided not to, and he was asked to pass along another name for consideration. And the name that he passed along is the main person who I discuss in this article. His name was Harold Evans, who had a tie bigger than anybody seen. And this was the picture chosen for the front page of the New York Times on May 14th, 1948. So this person was going to be, Harold Evans was going to be the special municipal commissioner for Jerusalem. He was a lawyer from Philadelphia. Very little experience to no experience in Palestinian politics, Arab history, anything like that. He was chosen mostly because he was a Quaker, because he was a pacifist, and because the United Nations was determined to solve their own question through their own means. And somebody in the United States, and I have to think about proximity as well here, of Philadelphia to New York as well. So there's lots of geographical connections within the United States that are at play here too. So Harold Evans was decided to take the job, even though, as the title indicates, he said in the New York Times that I won't say I wanted the job, but he felt obligated to take it, especially after Clarence Pickett did not. So he's the municipal commissioner, but because he's a pacifist, he refuses to have military protection to go to Jerusalem immediately after the proclamation of the State of Israel and the Nakba. So he doesn't go to Jerusalem. He's essentially the mayor, but he does not go. He's finally convinced to go to Cairo about a week later, where him and another Quaker are just kind of waiting this out. And they wait some more, and they wait more. And finally in early June, so a good 3 weeks after he's been named the UN representative and the special municipal commissioner, he finally sets off on a tour of the Mashriq, of the Middle East. And he stays in Jerusalem for 2 hours. That is it. He's there for 2 hours. He goes around to a couple of other places. He go to Tel Aviv, to Amman, and then he returns to Cairo. And he realizes when he's in Cairo that he can do squat diddly. He can do very little for any of this. And he resigns 2 days later. He just knows that there's what the UN has in store is not fit for him, and he can't fulfill his duties without being under military protection. The other thing that plays a factor in his resignation was the same week that he was hired, Count Folke Bernadotte was also hired to be to essentially oversee peace in Palestine, but with a special, easy for me to say, special emphasis on Jerusalem as well. So Evans thought that there was 2 people hired to do exactly the same thing. So when he left Cairo, there was an interim commissioner, Pablo de Azcarate, who was named. He was a Spanish diplomat who had been involved in Jerusalem, but he did not have nearly the same powers that Evans would have had. Clarence Pickett remarked when Harold Evans accepted the job that he could almost rule as a dictator, which is a really, really odd moniker to put on a pacifist lawyer from Philadelphia who's governing Jerusalem through the United Nations, but we'll maybe overlook that a little bit. And Azcarate, as the interim commissioner, did not have those same wide sweeping powers. He was just more a placeholder. But the United Nations did not really engage in having more municipal commissioner discussions, because by the middle of June and Evans' departure, the conflict as a result of the Nakba had the UN looking elsewhere. And they also instituted something called the Palestine Conciliation Commission, which is what I looked at mostly for this project. So this article comes out of my master's thesis. And this Palestine Conciliation Commission was partially to work with Palestinian refugees. And then the other part was the internationalization of Jerusalem. So the municipal commissioner took a back seat until September of 1949, where we see this come up once again as the PCC, as the Palestine Conciliation Commission releases its draft instrument. Alberto Gonzalez Fernandez, a Colombian diplomat, was asked to be the special municipal commissioner once again to complement the draft report. And he lasted 9 days on the job. He never went to Jerusalem, but he saw his appointment as being belated. He saw the PCC report as essentially filling his role. This was also about pretty much a year to the day of Count Bernadotte's assassination in Jerusalem as well, and was very aware of that, where the UN did not seem to be aware of that. Also, his wife was very sick. It was just not a good situation, and he thought about it. He did a couple of official things, but then 9 days later, he stepped back, and that was the last real attempt at the special municipal commissioner by the United Nations. It was just, and the same with internationalization of Jerusalem as well. This cookie cuttering of the city really died out after 1949 and after September of 1949. There were a few letters sent by various Arab delegations who saw the continuing encroachment of Zionists. Zionists continued moving buildings and offices into Jerusalem, so looking to the United Nations to do something about it, and those letters barely got any response as well. And then there were joint letters from Arab delegations, but internationalization never happened. And even though there were 2 special municipal commissioners named, spent a total of about 3 weeks on the job and 2 hours in the city that were assigned to govern. And the question as well, and what ties all of this together, is the interrupted futures. So then the interrupted future for who? This was an interrupted future for the United Nations. This was solely a UN venture. It was never something that Palestinians wanted, that Arabs wanted, that Zionists wanted. This was a top-down, very problematic aspect. The special municipal commissioner never had any real support from populations in Palestine. Neither really did the internationalization of Jerusalem until about 1952, 1953, when the Zionist encroachment on the city was really, really heightened. So UN, this was all about the UN. And yeah. And so when we're thinking about the interrupted futures, I think we need to see what the UN was doing. And it's easy as well. And a lot of the historiography about the UN focuses on the outcome rather than the intent. So if we're looking at the outcome of this, it's a pretty minor story. The UN tried something, it didn't work, oh no. But if we're looking at the intent, and the intent of being an imperial venture and an attempt to take away a city from various populations, becomes much, much more important. So, thank you.
Thank you, Harris. We already have a few questions. One actually was posed earlier, but I think it's a relevant question to you about the power of the UN. And it's a question from Hugh McGuire, who asks, are we assuming that the UN has and had more power than it does? The confusion at the end of World War II, which was a continuation of World War I suspect made Zionism a minor issue, and the Muslim population was regarded as unimportant. Is this true? So I guess if you could speak to that question.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the power of the UN comes up a lot. Like, what exactly is it? How does it work? All of this, and this is an interesting time as well. So we're seeing the United Nations inherit something from the League of Nations, its predecessor, that famously did very little to promote world peace, and some might say exacerbated a lot of the conflict that happened globally as well. The UN wanted to put a stamp on itself and on the world, and Jerusalem was a really ambitious swing at this. Had there been an internationalization of the city, which was not unprecedented either. There was like Gdansk in Poland, and Trieste as well in what's today's Italy, had been somewhat international cities through the League of Nations. So this was not entirely new. What was new was the ambition of taking Jerusalem and plucking it out of Palestine. I don't really know about the power question too much. I think it's much better to be looking at it in terms of that outcome versus intent as well. If you're looking at the outcome for this, the UN had very little power, but it did have the power to implement imperialism, and through its key member states as well at this time. And even still, you look at the construction of the Security Council now of having veto power, and if anything negative comes up about Israel, it's instantly shut down. So it has the power to be imperial. Whether or not it has the power to internationalize a city, I don't know if that's super relevant. It has the intention, or had the intention of doing that. So yeah, that's how I'd answer that.
Thanks. We also have a question from Sam Bahur. What was the position of the Jordanian who signed off on behalf of the Arabs? You mentioned that there had to be 4 parties, and the one who kind of gave the agreement from the Arab delegation was a Jordanian. So do you know what his position was?
So he was based in New York as well as like the Jordanian representative to the UN. And Transjordan was not part of the UN at this time. So I suspect that the signing off on this was part of the plan, in the hopes of like currying favor with the United Nations to get Jordan a seat at the General Assembly. That's fully an assumption on my part, but there were lots of discussions of like Jordan wanting to do certain things to get into the United Nations. Same with Israel after it was created. So likely had something to do with that. There was very little about communications between Al-Husseini, who was the individual who signed off on it, and King Abdullah, or Abu Tawfiq al-Huda, the prime minister at the time. But my guess is that it had to do with being admitted into the United Nations.
And question from Stephanie Reich. You mentioned kind of at the end that in the 1950s there was kind of particular Zionist encroachment on Jerusalem. Could you say a little bit more about that?
So that was more like the government offices as well, which were meant to be in Tel Aviv. And what a lot of these letters were writing about was saying, hey, UN, you came up with this partition plan that said that Jerusalem was not going to be Zionist, and now there's the movement of government offices into Jerusalem. Why have you backtracked on this? Essentially, these were not specifically from Palestinians. Lots of joint letters. Libya was a really big contributor to these letters, and it was basically just saying to the United Nations, it's only been 4 years. Why are you allowing this? And these letters continued in like 52, 53, and 54 before the trail runs a little bit thin, because there was nothing really done. And I suspect 56 would be the end as well. But basically, it was pleas from various Arab governments, and this is where we kind of see the actualization of the homogenization as well, where Arab governments wrote together to the United Nations, because that's how the United Nations saw the Arab world in a lot of ways, to stop the movement of official offices from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem.
Thank you. All right, if there's no further questions for now for Harris, we'll move to our final presentation. Last but certainly not least, Falastin Naily will present on the article, her contribution with Jawad Dokhran to the special issue on the 1963 General Plan for Jerusalem and the unrealized vision for the eastern part of the city. Falastin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alex. So this is an article I wrote together with Jawad Dokhran, who can't be with us today, unfortunately. I'd like to introduce him. So he's an architect, a researcher, and curator based in Amman, who has worked for Columbia University Studio X, and who's currently the National Project Manager for the Climate Change Project at UN Habitat Jordan. So we we worked on this 1963 general plan for Jerusalem, which he basically showed me a few years back, and which I then promised myself one day to work on together with him, because it's a truly unique document, and which basically which basically only exists in the private archives of his late uncle Ahmed Dorgan. Laura, yes, if you would like to start sharing the title slide, and I realized that Harris and I have the same aesthetic choices for today. So in this article, Jawad and I analyzed the comprehensive urban plan that was commissioned by the municipality of Jerusalem from Brown Engineers International in 1963, in light of the status of the city within Jordanian governance and politics, and also compared to earlier British plans. This plan was the basis for the 1966 town scheme that was submitted to the Jordanian government by Henry Kandel, who was in charge of city planning for the municipality between 63 and 66, knowing that he already held this office during the mandate years. Faced with the extreme reduction of the space for urban development after the division of the city, this 1963 plan ambitioned to lay the basis for a complete city and to compensate for the lack of vital infrastructures. We can go to the second slide. So I'm sharing with you the table of contents of this plan, which counts 144 pages, and which virtually deals with all aspects of life in the city, as you can see. According to the authors, the plan resulted from extensive consultations with what they call responsible bodies, officials, officers, and notables concerned with the affairs and welfare of Jerusalem and its future, along with, as they say, sound principles of planning. Since the War of 1948 and the division of the city, the truncated eastern part of Jerusalem lacked vital infrastructures and economic opportunities. This was the result of mandate-era planning and development that had favored the western part of the city over its eastern segment. And this was later compounded by the division of the city. Furthermore, the ethnic cleansing of the western neighborhoods and villages in 1948 had forced tens of thousands of Palestinians to seek refuge in the already cramped old city and adjacent neighborhoods. The municipality of East Jerusalem, under Jordanian control as of December 1948, was faced with a huge number of immediate problems to be resolved before it could eventually turn its attention to urban planning. Now, most construction occurring during that period was actually located outside the planning area of approximately 12 square kilometers. So one of the first recommendations of the 1963 plan was to expand the planning area to 75 square kilometers by including several adjacent villages. The plan paid particular attention to the restoration and protection of the old city. And I think you hear the sounds of mandate plans here. And proposed to create also integrated residential neighborhoods for future developments outside of the old city. The plan contained concepts for constructing a civic neighborhood, concentrating local administration and cultural institutions, but official government buildings were conspicuously absent from the list of planned structures. We can go to the next slide. So the concept of residential neighborhoods actually really interested myself and Jawad. You see this, this image of these rectangular neighborhoods. They were conceived for 5,000 to 10,000 persons and were to be characterized by the absence of major streets within its limits and the presence of a central area for elementary schools, neighborhood stores, places of worship, a center of assembly, and a clinic, all arranged in a campus-like manner, with an abundance of trees, large playing fields, and with smaller recreational areas closer to the houses for the smaller children. These are the words of the authors. The authors proposed a large square neighborhood made up of 9 small squares to maximize land use, considering the provision of open areas for playgrounds and other public facilities as a means of reducing the size of individual parcels for houses. So as we can see clearly, the entire concept takes into account the limited space on which East Jerusalem could develop and the general situation of the city. But at the same time, it tries to create an ideal setting for families and small children. There is, however, a dissonance between these plans and resettlement schemes for old city residents that are referred to elsewhere in the plan. The residents of overcrowded areas of the old city were to be resettled in what the authors call basic shell public housing units, leaving the interior finishing to be completed by the occupants. A proposal of a very different standard of living, far from the concept of the integrated residential neighborhood you see here. There are no clear indications as to the location of these resettlement areas in this text, but one of the maps shows the western parts of Aisawiya south of Shuafat as the primary site, whereas the eastern part of Aisawiya was designated as an urban residential district. I'd like to also talk very briefly about another aspect of this plan, which concerns the image of the old city, and in many ways is a sort of déjà vu of mandate plans for the old city. So the stated objective of the 1963 plan was to assure the preservation and enhancement of the old city, and to relate the unique role of this old and venerated human settlement to the family of other great cities throughout the world. And this plan also refers to Jerusalem as a religious capital several times. And there's one quote from the plan, which I think sort of resumes the entire vision that they had of the old city and by extension of Jerusalem. And so let me quote extensively. In the usual sense of the term, Jerusalem has no parks, but in a unique sense, all of Jerusalem has park-like character. In dreaminess and poetic thought, one can visualize the Haram area, following the advent of an abundant water supply for Jerusalem, with broad expanses of lawns evenly rolled, walkways carefully trimmed, an occasional well-tended flower garden, and shade trees throughout. Above this carpet, one sees the magnificence of the architecture of the many domes, minarets, prayer niches, and arcades growing out of the dignified stone pavement upon which man walks and worships, as nowhere else this side of paradise. I'm not going to dwell more into this, but I think you get the idea, and you can see the sort of continuity with mandate era plans, and particularly actually with the philosophy of Henry Candle, who had been the chief urban planner in the 1930s in Jerusalem, and now was again fulfilling this function for the Jordanian government. Another thing that caught our attention as we read through this plan was the particular status attributed to Jerusalem as a sort of civic center and a locale of cultural leadership. So in general, this overall land use plan divides the city according to various functions and characteristics. The old city and the Mount of Olives were set apart as monumental sites of historical interest framed by green spaces. The urban center was the modern commercial heart of the city, whereas the transportation district to be created would serve the city's inhabitants as well as tourists. What interests us here is the civic center that involved the construction of a municipal administrative center and also of an auditorium west of Nablus Road, and the reservation of the area between Salah ad-Din Road and Nablus Road as a predominantly open area for institutions and cultural activities. Sorry. Moreover, the plan called for the construction of an amphitheater outside the southeast corner of the old city, and for that of a national university near the airport, in order to, as the authors say, assure and maintain the cultural leadership for Jerusalem throughout the Middle East. This university was envisioned as a four-year university and was an integral part of a strategy of enhancing the position of Jerusalem in terms of cultural leadership and prominence within the nation. And this is a quote. While the absence of government institutions clearly signified Jerusalem's lack of official political status, this plan seems to attribute a different sort of leadership role to the city, namely in the realms of culture and higher education. Was this then the possible niche that Jerusalem was to hold within the Hashemite kingdom? Coupled with the civic center concept, this approach seems in any case to be an attempt to attribute a particular status to the city and to its inhabitants. So my voice is starting to, to leave me. I'm going to conclude rather quickly. The plans of 1963 and the town scheme adopted in 1966 were interrupted by war, military occupation, and colonial policies of ethnic cleansing and expropriation. Not knowing what was ahead, the authors of the 1963 plan set a large horizon for the implementation of their proposal. They wrote, "A recommendation need not necessarily be feasible before it is included in the overall plan. If the objective is a desirable one, the time may arrive when its implementation will become feasible." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philistine. It seems almost cruel now to ask you questions since your voice is, you've already given so much of your voice to us today. But I do want to invite any questions for Philistine or any of our panelists at this time. Put them in the Q&A box. I have a few questions for Philistine, but I'll let you take a sip of water first. But again, kind of questions for any of our participants are welcome. We'll have an open Q&A if there's any further questions for any of the earlier presentations. Two questions for Philistine. One, you mentioned the kind of plans to resettle old city residents kind of outside, and kind of the distinction between the kind of, I don't know if it's a garden city, but kind of residential planning versus the kind of rather austere sounding plans for the old city residents that were going to be removed. And kind of, it makes me think recently in Jerusalem Quarterly, we've published a few articles on the kind of the establishment of Shafat camp and the kind of removal of refugees and others who were in what was called the Muaskar camp in the old city to Shafat. And I was curious if that was kind of, if there's any connection between those plans and the plans you see in the 1963 plan to move old city residents. Did they have in mind the kind of residents of Muaskar? And then, I mean, it strikes me also that kind of, putting out this idea, when you mentioned kind of the lack of any kind of government buildings or kind of political buildings, whether that also speaks to kind of the fear of the Hashemite government of the kind of producing a potentially a rival kind of political, or kind of a rival center for power and kind of political legitimacy and authority, given the kind of their reliance on British backing, from everything, from the military to the kind of town planning or city planning.
Yeah, thanks for these questions, Alex. Actually, there seems to be a sort of a common genealogy in this resettlement scheme idea. And I had a look at Christy Berger's article about the Muaskar camp and the way this resettlement was planned by UNRWA, basically, in Shafat. I don't know if this sort of genealogy becomes clearer in the actual 1966 town scheme that Kendall developed, because I didn't have a chance to look at the entire document. I didn't get my hands on it. So I don't know, maybe that 1966 town scheme makes some of these things more explicit. And I think it would be really interesting to look at it. And also I was quite frustrated because I didn't really see it pinned down in the plans, which areas they were talking about, which informal settlements they wanted to dismantle. But yeah, I think part of that becomes clearer in the 1966 plan. And actually Vincent Lemire's article and his book, I think might also provide some answers on that. Yeah, and the other question about the place attributed to Jerusalem is, of course, vital. I mean, Jerusalem was the only city aside from Amman, which became Amana and not a Baladia. So there was a sort of upgrade in status for Jerusalem, only rivaled by Amman. But clearly Jerusalem wanted to be in any way a rival to Amman, and Amman centralized many functions, not only government functions, but also economically. It really, by the 50s, had already become a sort of clearinghouse for the economy of both banks. And so the status attributed to the city was always thought in relationship to what was held to be the necessary centrality, let's say, of Jordan, which was Amman.
Thank you. Well, I see we're coming just about to 11:30 now, and I don't see any additional questions, but I just want to thank now all of you for your contributions to the special issue and for joining us today. Thank you, Julio. Thank you, Samih. Thank you, Harris. And especially thank you, Philistine, for organizing this issue and for organizing this panel. Thanks to Lisa Taraki, my co-editor, and to Laura and IPS. And thank you to all of you for joining us.